if the books are canon, but it would also 100% confirm that canonically, the first 3 to 4 games are in-universe games. But what this changes is the reliability of those games for lore purposes. This allows for Scott and Steelwool to retcon certain details from those games without them really being retcons. They're just something Steve made up.
Sorry, Tom. Overall, I really like this video, but I'm afraid that this is one conclusion that you've come to I can confidently say is 100% false. Hello, Internet! Welcome to— Wait, I can't move my— Why can't I move my arms? I've been PNG'd! No! Ah! I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm back to normal. Now, if you haven't seen the most recent FNAF game theory, which I'd be surprised if you hadn't, they finally tackled what's arguably the biggest debate in the FNAF community at the moment: if the books are canon, or more accurately, if the books are in the game's continuity. Whatever side of the debate you land on, yes or no, is not something I'm going to try to convince you today. I've done that previously in this video. But for the sake of transparency, I personally lean towards, at the very least, the Tales books being game canon. However, something that I am surprised I'm going to have to defend today is the canonicity of the original FNAF games. FNAF 1, 2, 3, and 4. Screw the book debate, can we even trust that the games are in the game's timeline? Excluding Into the Pit. God, I hate having to clarify that. This really all started back with the release of Help Wanted, where in the intro sequence we learn that a rogue indie game developer has been making games based on the franchise's dark history, while we get images from the previous games in the series and the game developer looking just like Scott Cawthon. The purpose of this VR game we're beta testing is to compile all of these childish ghost stories that have affected the brand, which Fazbear says are mostly lies, and make fun of themselves and these silly ghost stories in an effort to move on and start anew. Now, most of you already know this, and also know this is a bunch of baloney. Yes, a game developer made indie games based off of the Freddy's brand, and this developer looks like Scott, but he wasn't rogue. Fazbear's hired the game developer to make their dark and true history seem ridiculous, fantastical, by making it into silly video games, to make light of what actually happened.
Fazbear Entertainment hired the game developer. Those indie games were designed to conceal and make light of what happened. This isn't just an attempt to rebrand. It's an elaborate cover-up, a campaign to discredit everything.
This way they could just swoop in and pretend all of their baggage was made up by this one guy, make fun of it in their own game, and then move forward stronger than ever. The point of the cover-up is that everything did happen. Understandably, there was still some confusion after this though, but thankfully this is one of the few times Scott himself would come out and be, well, direct and actually give us answers. Less importantly, if the game developer is actually Scott himself, the short answer is no. My name is never actually mentioned in the game. The game says that an indie developer was tarnishing the brand of Fazbear Entertainment by making video games about them, forcing them to rebrand and try to reclaim their good name by making a VR game that made light of those crazy stories. And more importantly, why the story decision was made. How do you take characters that are canon, along with characters that are questionably canon, and characters from every point of the timeline, and throw them all together in one game that is canon? That's quite the problem when you think about it. But it was important for me that Help Wanted meant something. I didn't want just a meaningless collection of minigames, although I'm sure most people would have been okay with that. I wanted it to be canon, and that meant I needed to solve the substantial puzzle of how. The lore around Help Wanted was specifically crafted to fit into the previous games, not the other way around, and Scott towards the end of the post reiterates. So no, I'm not canon, Reddit isn't canon, the fan games aren't canon, you aren't canon. Only the existence of a game developer that supposedly made video games based on actual events that may or may not be a cover-up by Fazbear Entertainment is canon. The events we've seen in our games happened. In actuality, we've never even seen what the proper in-universe games are like. We know they're probably pretty darn close to our games. Heck, in Help Wanted, the first 3 FNAF games are straight up called FNAF, FNAF 2, and FNAF 3. And given Help Wanted 2's inclusion of these sprites, the minigames were probably there as well. But there's one notable absence here that makes me think that these in-universe games were slightly different. Where's Golden Freddy? The Phantoms are in 3, and the Shadow Bonnie cutout in the corn maze shows he's a character, so where's Golden Freddy? The closest thing here is the "it's me" appearing in the barn, but even then we have more solid evidence nowadays that that's not directly tied to Golden Freddy. Yes, he says it a lot, but he's not the only one. It's not direct proof that he's here, as a character or in spirit. But okay, tangent aside in regards to how one-to-one our games are versus the in-universe ones. I think it's clear here from a meta and in-universe narrative that whatever these games are, the events we've played through up to this point in the series did happen, and they just so happen to be games in-universe as well. These points do not affect each other. This story point is just a creative workaround to allow characters to be used that otherwise would not make any sense being here. It's honestly one of the things in the series that I think isn't too deep, and we just kind of overthink it. So, let's see what Game Theory had to say about this at the time.
If FNAF VR's tapes are to be believed, pretty much everything we know could all be thrown out as complete fabrications. The long story short here is that FNAF VR, in making Scott part of the Fazbear cover-up, is the franchise's way of rebooting the story. It's explicitly telling us that everything we've known up to this point is wrong. It's a distraction.
Now, the core of what they're trying to get at here, FNAF's lore, essentially rebooting, starting fresh, is what's happening here, and that's a good thing. But they also apply this scorched earth mentality to the original games, as if both old and new lore can't coexist, that the new must override the old. Game Theory effectively believed Fazbear Entertainment's cover-up. There is, of course, them also saying here that Scott is a character in the series, but to be fair, Scott's post came out only a few days before the Game Theory episode released. I'm sure they were already pretty far along in the production pipeline and didn't really see a need to change it. But perhaps Scott saw this and got annoyed, because fast forward a few years later and we have a full short story about this indie game developer, Steve Snodgrass, in a story appropriately titled Help Wanted. Once again, most of you are probably familiar with the broad strokes of the story, but to give a quick recap, the story follows Steve as he's approached by a Fazbear representative to make 4 horror games based off the rumors around Freddy's. He declines due to Fazbear's wanting him to work in a remote location with no outside contact, making games based on real tragedies is a bit distasteful, and because he doesn't want to make horror games. So Fazbear's natural reaction is to catfish him, knock him unconscious, and then have him wake up to 2 kids and a wife. A completely fake family using robots and illusion disc technology. They get Steve to agree to make the games, but also slowly terrorize him with illusions as he works to give him inspiration for the games, driving him almost completely insane. Eventually he is able to escape, but he chooses to stay with his fake family and dies for being a dummy. This story cemented the idea for MatPat that specifically the first 4 FNAF games were now unreliable due to the games being made by a guy who only knew the rumors of Freddy's. And they also go on to say that any info we get from Sister Location onwards is still completely reliable and can be used. Which, in all honesty, given their previous thoughts, is a perfectly reasonable takeaway from this story, especially if you believe the games Steve made are the exact same as ours. My issue is not with their conclusion here. This video is like 2 years old, and it's not like they've largely deviated from how we understand the series since then. They've stuck to things like, yes, the MCI kids do possess the animatronics, and yes, Golden Freddy does still exist. As they always say, that video was just a theory. Frankly, I had largely forgotten what their thoughts were on this. I had planned to make this video talking about what the tapes mean for the games anyway without mentioning game theory. So imagine my surprise when right before starting on this, Tom brings up this exact topic again in his book's canon video. That is just straight up the 0 point field in effect. I had to talk about this now. Tom reiterates the same points as before. The first 4 games being just games allows Scott and Steelwool to change details in the original games without them being retcons. While if something in the new games does confirm something from the old, that specific detail stays canon or is confirmed canon. My issue here is that they say this while mentioning stories like Didophobia telling us how the nightmares work, but don't bring up that we now know thanks to the Monty Within that Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator is also an in-universe game, and the fact that Help Wanted 2 has a sister location level, heavily implying that it's likely all of the original Scott games have in-universe counterparts besides Ultimate Custom Night, with Cassie noting that Nightmarion originates from that old VR game. So, what's the explanation here? If what game theory currently claims about the first 4 games is true, logically that same thought process should extend to all 6 original games now, depending on how the last 2 were developed. And this would be incredibly frustrating. I said previously I think we actually overthink this a bit, but if we have to fix this, I have somewhat of an explanation. Game Theory's big issue here with the reliability of the games is Steve's lack of solid facts on Fazbear's past. But keep in mind that when Steve is first approached by Fazbear Entertainment, they immediately want him to go to a remote location to work on these games. They're apparently afraid of leaks. They say Steve would have a lot of creative freedom to do as he wishes with the games, but I think the intent here was to always terrorize him with illusions and subliminal messaging, getting him to make the exact games Fazbear's would want. But Steve would believe he was coming up with the ideas on his own. We know that replicable illusions are completely possible in the series with the Twisted Ones and Baby in the Fourth Closet, as well as Rory seeing the nightmares the same way Mike does in FNAF 4. So Fazbear's could be terrorizing Steve with exactly what they want him to see. That way, there'd be no way Fazbear's was covering up their past. It genuinely would seem like he came up with all of these tall tales on his own. Remember that the point of these games was to bring light to real events for the VR game to swoop in and discredit. If his employment by Fazbear's was questioned at any point later on, they could just simply deny they hired him. It's easier to cover up one guy than decades of history, or they always just plan to kill him. So, if you want to say that the in-universe games are exactly the same as ours and need to explain how they're still reliable retellings of Fazbear's history, there you go. But how do we explain the last two indie games? Clearly they aren't made by Steve, but I think it's actually a meta explanation for why they play so differently from the first four. The first four are made, but with the fourth being a lore mess, and the last two being more sleek, polished, and narratively focused, in-universe made by somebody else. I think the fact there's a developer change here at all, though, continues to reinforce my belief that however close these in-universe games are to ours, these games and their development are not one-to-one with our games, and our games should still absolutely be trusted. Yes, new games in the series can alter our understanding or straight up retcon things from the previous games, but that's not a unique thing from these games to the old games, Charlie being a prime example. But FNAF 1 through 4 should still be treated as mostly reliable. I don't mean to make this video as a aha gotcha to Game Theory. In fact, I'm kinda glad they released their video when they did. It gave me the perfect in to talk about this and explain that the original 6 FNAF games do have existing in-universe games, but that this does not and should not affect how we treat those games for lore purposes. It's very similar to Nightmare Balloon Boy in FNAF 4. They are canon because their minigame can be played in the non-Halloween mode of FNAF 4, while simultaneously being able to work in the timeline. It's mostly to serve the gameplay. All this to say, I hope going forward that Game Theory doesn't treat the early games as easily rewritable or dismiss tons of old evidence in favor of a new story, while both old and new can coexist. Game Theory hasn't really done this yet, but with them now being more open to tales being game canon and what their takeaway from Help Wanted's story is, it's a serious possibility. I don't often do videos like this, bringing up other people's theories and analyzing/criticizing them, but given the insane timing of the release of their video with my schedule, I felt like I'd be dumb to pass up using their point of view as a springboard for this video. And no matter how big or small creators are on YouTube, there are real people behind most channels here. So remember not to harass anyone and to always be respectful with your criticisms for me, Game Theory, or anybody else. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and hit the like button and maybe subscribe while you're down there if you want to see more videos from me in the future. But if you'd like to see more of my stuff now, I recommend checking out my previous video, where I try to unravel the insanity that is Return to the Pit. Bye everyone!